Oh, God, I'm bored of this room.
You need one of. Did you not see the picture of the pirate fort that I was planning on
I
decamping
did.
to?
I was very jealous.
You need one of those. That's what you need.
That would be so cool. I'm very disappointed you're not there now.
Yeah. I think it would be a bit distracting with the dragons.
I've got a message from PV saying now. That means we're live. Hi everyone, and welcome to this latest event from the UK in a Changing Europe, where we're going to present to you our new report on comfortable levers. And I'm very, very happy to have with us today Ceri Davies from NatCen, with whom we worked on the focus groups that lay behind the two reports that you can access today. Our own Dan Wincott from the University of Cardiff, who's going to talk briefly through some of the things he found interesting in the work. Paula Surridge, Deputy Director, UK in a Changing Europe. I'm particularly happy to welcome Matt Holehouse from The Economist, who's going to give us his thoughts as well. As ever, send your questions in on the Slido. If you can vote for questions, that makes my job a lot happier, because it means I don't have to choose. I can just go with public opinion, which I always like to do. But without further ado, Ceri, over to you. If you can kick us off.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so my kind of brief introduction is really just to outline what we did with the research, why we did it, and some very kind of top level headlines about what we found from the groups that we were talking to. That Dan and Paula will pick up in more detail, and Matt already has done so and will continue to expand on, hopefully. So my bit will be the kind of brief descriptive bit, and then hopefully engage with a bit of discussion shortly afterwards. So as you'll see from the report, really our goal was to try and explore some of the attitudes and aspirations of this group, the royal we, which was just including us all in this, have termed comfortable leavers. And these are groups of people who are relatively affluent, leave voters, or people who did vote leave in the EU referendum. So the people that are relatively wealthy compared to the regional median in their area. And this group kind of came about as a site of interest for two reasons, I think. One was that a lot of work kind of post-referendum was having a look at trying to understand the vote and understand the leave vote. And the economy and economic circumstances were something which were really to the fore. And some really excellent, interesting work was done looking at people who have lower incomes to try to understand the extent to which leaving might have been a form of protest vote, or a kind of call for attention, or a raising of issues which people were unhappy with, that Brexit signalled a moment of change for. And whilst work was done in these areas, this group of comfortable leavers was left relatively under-researched. So UK in a Changing Europe had a particular interest in trying to actually expand our understanding of what that group might think. And the second part that related to that is that previous work that NatCen had done on their panel, their public opinion panel, had identified a group of people over time who they termed affluent Eurosceptics, who in many senses share lots of characteristics of comfortable leavers. So people who tend to be higher income, that are conservative voters, and on the affluent Eurosceptic side certainly have noticeably anti-welfare views. So kind of coalescing among a group of people who we thought it would be good to hear a little bit more about and try to understand what really mattered to them about Brexit and what their priorities might be as a result of taking this choice to leave the European Union. So that was really the sort of setup for the work. And what we did back in July last year now was run 8 deliberative workshops across the UK. 6 of those were in England, different regions in England. 1 was in Wales, 1 was in Scotland. So we talked to a total of 130 people across those workshops and explored, as I say, kind of what matters, what changes they anticipated or were hoping for as a result of leaving the European Union. Their priorities and their hopes. And the other thing we wanted to learn from this group of people was whether there was a distinction between the views of comfortable leavers and comfortable remainers. That's not a term you'll find in the report, by the way. But we didn't just want to talk to leavers, we also wanted to talk to remainers as a way to try and put some of those attitudes and perspectives in relief and try to understand whether, in fact, there were areas in which those groups shared views, or whether there remained a kind of clear distinction in this category. So off we went. And conducted the research. And what we asked people to do in those workshops, which took about 2.5 hours each, all run online. And in each we were going for an approximate division of about 10 leavers and 6 remainers. So we wanted to kind of over-recruit on the leave side. Is we asked people to discuss what mattered to them and what their priorities were in the context of sort of 4 main areas. So the first area was society, how we live. The second was identity, who we are. The third was around economy and services, and the fourth was around governance. And we purposely chose those kind of main blocks, fairly large as they are, in order to give some shape to the discussion about what mattered and to try to kind of keep a common thread across workshops. So that was the sort of main setup. In terms of kind of headline findings, what we've done in the report is really prioritise, of course, the views of those who voted leave. And we brought in, where necessary, the views of those Remainers as a way to kind of distinguish or overlap in perspective. But I think what we excuse me, generally found from comfortable leavers is that there were two main things that really mattered to them about the Brexit vote. And the first of those was immigration, and the second of those was governance / sovereignty. And both of these things were tied to a third aspect of how that drove perceptions of British identity, and how it was the makeup of those two things also related to how they saw themselves and how they saw Britain. So just to expand on that very briefly, because I know others will too. The first, in terms of the impact of, so what you'll see in the report is obviously there are a number of things which are elaborated on in terms of immigration, in terms of how it's seen. But rather than go into that just now, I think that the driver in relation to sense of identity was that there was a general feeling amongst comfortable leavers that Britain was becoming too accommodating of other cultures. You know, one of the potential drivers of immigration was that. And as a result, a sense of a clear British and distinct British identity, as they saw it, was at potential of being lost or subsumed into this kind of more diverse or sort of plural overview. So it really mattered to them that there was a way in which to try and kind of regain or retain a sense of that. And the second aspect of sort of sense of identity, which related more to governance, was that it was really important to people to, as someone put in the report, for the UK to be the captain of its own ship again. This idea, obviously the implication being that we're certainly not in terms of our membership to the EU, so it was really important to get back to that. And as a result, kind of restore, again, sense of British identity. Connected to that with respect to governance was also the idea that self-sufficiency and the idea that the UK could be self-sufficient was an important value, not just in terms of immigration, but also in terms of trade, in terms of agriculture, in terms of forms of production. And there was an overarching sense, which I'm sure others will also talk about with this intersection of immigration, governance and identity. There was a certain nostalgia or a degree of romanticism to a kind of time past amongst leavers in particular that was an important part of underpinning what people perceived they didn't have now and would seek with the idea that we could retain aspects of sovereignty and related ideas. The third thing which came through really strongly was around the economy, but rather than be talked about explicitly as a kind of what matters or priority for why people voted to leave, apart from in Scotland, which was the exception, the economy was talked about more in terms of priorities for the future. So the connection between leaving the UK, leaving the EU, get it the right way around, in three main ways. One was that people were seeking greater autonomy over trade relationships, which we've heard more generally in the population, but is also the case for this group. There was some discussion in terms of priorities for the economy that leaving the EU would give a priority to British people for British jobs. So this became something that was significant. But also people were really keen to see the return of manufacturing. And even though that was a general sense across many of these groups, this was particularly strong in Wales, in the Northeast, in Scotland and in the West Midlands. So across those kind of three main areas, this is where the main discussion happened with respect to leavers. Just before I stop talking, I did just want to reflect very briefly on the fact that also, obviously, some of the priorities that we saw were more or less shared across Leave voters and people who voted Remain. And it was really clear that in terms of restoring sovereignty, so with respect to governance, Leave and Remain voters were quite far apart. But in terms of a desire to see sort of increased political engagement, either through more devolved or more kind of localised forms of governance, actually Leavers and Remainers shared quite a lot of views in that regard. The other place in which Leavers and Remainers were a bit closer together were on questions of the economy. So both were quite keen to see post-Brexit trade keeping close relationships to the EU, and also wanting to see greater infrastructure and investment in public services. So it wasn't the case that people were completely distinct on all aspects of the things discussed. And there were some significant areas in which those views came together. But just in conclusion, in terms of the report, I think that one of the things that we've taken from the work that we've done is that in many ways, the more affluent Leave vote with this group, in contrast much of the work that's been done with lower income voters it can also be understood as a protest vote, but rather in socio-cultural terms, instead of purely driven by economic concerns. And this kind of discontent has driven a wish to take the opportunity of Brexit to force a moment of national change. And I think the other thing that came through strongly in the research is that whilst many Leavers, as well as Remainers, were concerned about the short-term negative economic consequences of Brexit, those on the Leave side continue to remain optimistic that over the mid to long term, Brexit would spur positive economic developments, a return to decision-making to the UK, and providing more control over immigration especially. And so those things kind of remain firm for people, and they were confident that that would come about over time. I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Ceri. We've got some questions coming in. And actually, Dan, if you're going to go next, I should just say that we've already had a question saying it'll be interesting to hear more about the differences with the Scottish group. So if you want to touch on that while you're talking, but if not, we'll cover it later.
Sure. Yeah, that's on my agenda already, Anand. So I'll pick that up. Thanks, Ceri, for a excellent overview of the research, pulling out some of the most important findings. With this research, I guess the thought that was always in the back of my mind, and I don't know if it's an urban myth or not, but the thought that was always in the back of my mind about this kind of missing group in how we understand Brexit and what people want from Brexit was always a thought about the West Kent Golf Club, which the story I've heard at any rate has it that that's where Nigel Farage, after he left school, got his first break in the city. So I kind of had the West Kent Golf Club as a kind of natural environment for a certain kind of leaver in my mind as we were doing this research. And I think some sense of that does come through the program of work. I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but as Ceri suggested, that there's a kind of strange mix here in that the comfortable leavers we spoke to, expected some bumpiness in the road around Brexit. They didn't expect that Brexit would be, the moment we left the EU, would be a moment of kind of liberation or fundamental change. Instead, it was a kind of opportunity to do things differently. And the things that comfortable leavers want to be done differently are kind of wrapped around in this sense of kind of optimistic nostalgia. So there is a looking back to the days before the UK joined the EU, and a sense that things were actually better then. That kind of collectively we were in charge of our own destiny at that time. But that sense of nostalgia also evokes a kind of set of aspirations for the future. And in relation to those future aspirations, I think the comfortable leavers do have high hopes. There are high hopes that they don't necessarily expect to be fulfilled. It's a kind of opportunity for the government to do something different. And that metaphor that Ceri drew out about being the captain of our own ship, I think also picks up on important aspects of what comfortable leavers want. They really have quite a strong sense of pride in the nation, and want the nation to be, what it once was again, possibly through significant investment in industry and apprenticeships, in the NHS, in social care, also in the police and the military. That came through quite strongly, particularly in England, and is, I think, quite a distinctive aspect of this particular group. So they want to restore something. In England in particular, although one or two people thought, flag waving was un-British, there was quite a lot of an appetite for more Union Jacks and more St. George's Crosses, actually. And for many of the people in England, there wasn't really a strong distinction between Englishness and Britishness in the way that they expressed their sense of national pride. There were one or two examples of people in England saying, we need to think about England in a different way. You know, who speaks for England? Why is it that there are 50 Scottish MPs interfering in our business? So there is a sense of kind of differentiation there, and that's quite powerfully present when we turn to Scotland, where you know, almost without exception, our Scottish comfortable leavers, they did identify as British, but first and foremost they identified as Scots. The research was done last summer, and at that time, even these comfortable leavers, who are by no means enthusiasts for the Scottish National Party, they're mostly people who don't want Scotland to become independent. Nevertheless, they thought Nicola Sturgeon was doing a really good job with the pandemic, and explicitly they thought that Boris Johnson was doing a bad job, which is not something we saw in England. In England, there was a certain sentiment, which I know some other work has also picked up, that that, you know, Boris Johnson should be really given a chance to manage the pandemic, that it was a kind of act of God that no one could really manage without facing some problems, and that personally he had quite a hard time. You know, he'd been ill, he had a new baby, had a lot of challenges, and that just didn't wash in Scotland at all. And if we turn to Wales briefly, you find a kind of a different position again, where the comfortable leavers in Wales were really quite skeptical about devolution. You know, they thought, and I think this is a kind of sentiment that is present in quite a lot of the discussions, they, you know, not really very keen on politicians. Politicians are kind of a waste of time and money, and devolution in Wales for this group is just an extra layer of unnecessary politicians who kind of get in the way, which marks them out really strongly from the Remainers that we spoke to in Wales, who very often are very keen on devolution and think that the First Minister in Wales, Mark Drakeford, has done a really good job. Just to wrap up a little bit more broadly on this group, on things that they shared right across Britain, although there were one or two people who were worried about, you know, how much their food was costing during the pandemic because they had to shop locally, they couldn't get to the big, less expensive supermarkets. In general, these comfortable leavers were people who were quite prepared to pay a bit more, especially if it meant they could buy local. And, you know, whilst they do see Brexit as an opportunity for a reset, and they do want Britain to make new trading arrangements, they absolutely don't want chlorinated chicken on their supermarket shelves. So the real trade-offs that new trading deals might require are trade-offs that these comfortable leavers feel quite uncomfortable about. You know, they want high quality local produce. They don't want hormone treated beef or chlorinated chicken coming in on the back of a trade deal with the US. So I'll wrap up there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dan. I've got a really interesting question in. I don't know if you want to take this now, Dan, but just you can all ponder it if you don't mind, which is, do you think comfortable leavers have more in common with comfortable Remainers or with less comfortable leavers? I'm going to leave that hanging for a moment. Do you want to come back on that straight away, Dan?
I can come back on some of it. So I think they do have quite a lot in common with low-income leavers. There are clearly some areas of commonality with other comfortably off people who voted Remain, but I think they're closer to the comfortable leavers on most issues. That's at least my impression. There's one standout difference, though, and Paula may pick this up. If not, we can pick it up in the conversation. The comfortable leavers are really concerned about kind of mollycoddled Brits. They're concerned that, you know, the welfare state is too generous, that it's made British people lazy, and you know, maybe that's why we've had to rely on migrants coming in from the EU or from the rest of the world to take the kind of jobs that Brits won't do, or maybe aren't qualified enough to do. There's a little hint maybe that the government should have done more to support apprenticeships, you know, and that might be a way forward, but actually quite a skepticism about laziness, which is really, I think, quite sharply different from the low-income leavers.
Brilliant, thank you. Paula?
Thank you. So I want to try and fill in a few of the gaps, because Ceri and Dan have already done a great job of covering what the comfortable leavers thought about things, and then just try and draw out what I think might be some of the political implications of this. So one of the things I was really struck by, we talk a lot about national identity, but the thing that I was really struck by in these workshop groups was the idea of pride around national identity, rather than it just being an identification. There's a real sense of pride, and people wanting to restore pride in some way, that kind of nostalgic optimism. And that really linked into some ideas where the idea of Britishness sort of slid over the top of lots of other issues. It was almost like a gel that held lots of different issues together. So people referred to things like the Keep Britain Tidy campaign, about having pride in local areas. Dan's already alluded to the kind of Buy British campaigns around food, but that was also around manufacturing. So that was the first thing, was that there was a sense here of wanting to restore pride. And obviously what you take pride in depends on your prior values to a certain extent. And we would find something very different if we spoke to Remainers about what they had pride in, I'm sure. But that was something that really came through for me. And then the way I've been thinking about the issues that this raises is around this kind of idea of the difference between expectations of Brexit and hopes for the future. So the expectations of what would happen directly as a result of Brexit were modest at best. People didn't think their industries would regenerate the day after Brexit happened. They weren't expecting things to change immediately, but they had really, really high hopes for the future. High hopes for the return of industry, but also for a broader social fabric. So lots of the groups talked about the loss of local police stations, of antisocial behaviour, of empty buildings. Dan's already mentioned apprenticeships. And I think we can see in that why back in 2019, which seems a long way away now, the idea of levelling up really spoke to these voters. Okay, it perhaps wasn't obvious immediately why those in more comfortable positions might be attracted to that agenda, but it talks to this kind of repair of the wider social fabric. And I think in that sense, you can almost see these voters as being anti-austerity in one sense, in the sense of wanting to see investment in institutions and support services, but as we've already touched on, really anti-welfare. So they were not wanting to see increases in benefit payments, particularly, though I think it's worth pointing out, to benefits that related to being out of work. So much more empathy and support where people were working hard but not quite making enough, compared to those that they felt were just not working hard enough. Now, politically, I think that means that for those that want us to keep talking about Brexit and keep going back to the difficulties that Brexit have caused, the expectations of this group of voters were modest. They didn't expect personal benefits. They didn't really expect immediate benefits for their areas. So in that sense, they're not going to be disappointed. The bar for Brexit to be a success for them is quite low. But they were expecting that the politicians the government would grasp the opportunities that this presented to them, and that they would see their areas regenerate, see industries come back, and all those things that they expected. So I think there is a real possibility of disappointment and disaffection actually as a result. So not necessarily a positive message for an opposition party. It might actually be a message that turns people off politics altogether. I'll pick up very quickly on that last question there that you asked, Dan, whether they have more in common with the comfy Remainers or the uncomfy Leavers. I'm sure, I don't think we've used that label before. I'm not sure I like it. And I think we need to go back to things I've said in the past on this, which is we've got lots of not tiny, but we've got lots of distinct groups in the electorate. And depending on which issue you push against, they will form together in different ways. So when you're talking about issues of economics, issues of welfare, that kind of dimension of issues, the comfy leavers and the comfy remainers have a lot in common. But when you start to talk about issues of national pride, immigration, and sovereignty, that's where the comfy leavers have much more in common, particularly with the older group within the low income leave. So it's something more in common. Have described this as a kaleidoscope. So each time you twist the groups around, you get a slightly different picture. I don't think that's quite capturing it, because I think it's a bit more like one of those children's mazes where when you twist things, they move around the maze and come together in different places, but it isn't random because there is a structure there to begin with. You can't get any pattern, you can't connect any group together, but you can connect the groups together in different ways.
Does that hold true for what you said about investment as well? Because I mean, the one question that crossed my mind when you were speaking was, they're in favour of greater investment. Are they in favour of funding it via their taxes? And that seems to me that, on that at least, is there a difference with the sort of comfortable remainers, that these are relatively well-off people who are willing to pay more to achieve something post-Brexit?
I don't think so. I mean, that isn't directly in the
no, it's not. And it's a slightly unfair question.
Workshops, but looking at the survey data that I've looked at on this, you find that the comfortable leavers do tend to sometimes be a little bit more left-wing on issues, but not markedly so. I think they kind of expected that there were savings that were going to be made elsewhere that could be put into these services, rather than it being a kind of desire for higher taxation. Although that, I think, has changed a little bit post-COVID.
Though at the very least, these focus groups help us understand why ministers have flags behind them when they talk on the telly these days. Matt.
Hello, hi. I read about British politics at the Economist, and sat in on a couple of the focus groups last summer, which were really, really useful and very, very interesting. And lots of themes that I heard in the two groups I see coming through very, very strongly in the report. There are a couple of things I wanted to talk about. One was sort of why I think this report is sort of really sort of important and interesting for how we think about politics, and then some of the work that I did after the focus groups on age and Brexit. And I guess sort of taking two steps back, the interest and the importance of the report for me is that we know this of the observable trends about who voted for Brexit in general. But to a large extent, they've really become stereotypes, which are quite dominant in the way in which we talk about politics now. So the idea of the downtrodden leader, the downtrodden leaver, the left behind leaver, and the idea of the Remain elite. And these stereotypes blend into all sorts of debates, so particularly around the self-identity of the Conservative Party, and we see them in lots of sort of news commentary as well. And in so much as those trends are real, they are sort of observable, but they also really strongly cloud out some exceptions to that, such as the fact that you have wealthy people who voted for Leave, and you have lots and lots of working class people who voted for Remain, even if those groups are sometimes minorities within those groups. And they occlude the fact that wealth and income are not synonymous with comfort and security, because you have to adjust for things like housing costs and where people live. And that's even truer on when you think about Brexit in a geographic sense. We as journalists are very used to talking about towns being Remain towns or Leave towns, whereas actually most towns in Britain, most towns in England particularly, were somewhere down the middle. Most areas, wherever you pick them on the map, probably had about half the people more or less voting Remain and half the people more or less voting Leave. And even at the extremes, your Hartlepool or your Islingtons, in both of those areas, there are a big chunk of people who voted either way. Now this is all kind of obvious, but I think also quite important, not just from a sort of a sense of academic accuracy, but also because these things have become self-fulfilling. Our politics is increasingly cast around these ideas of elites versus anti-elites. Particularly, we saw this coming through in the 2019 election. A lot of these ideas are infused with moral worth, the idea of the real voter versus the metropolitan voter. Dominic Cummings telling people to get out of telling journalists to get out of North London and go and visit some real voters. And and it's very, very strong when we talk about things like Brexit. So the idea that the loss of Erasmus is sort of trivial because it's a middle class concept. And so what we're seeing is not merely sort of an observing of identity, but a responding to real identity, but of creating it and creating a sort of a distorted vision of it. So I think it's really important to have reports that kind of jettison some of those and point out the strong degree of commonality or the large exceptions to those stereotypes. The second thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is about age and attitudes to growth and to Brexit, which is something I wrote about after sitting in the focus groups. And this idea of what is it about comfortable leavers? Well, what is it that connects being comfortable and being a leaver? And I think a strong factor of it, although not exclusively, is around age and this growing trend, I think, of what you might call anti-growth politics in Britain. And this came out quite strongly in some of the focus groups we sat in. So as well as some of the participants being pro-Brexit and being older, there was a strong feeling of sort of discomfort at new housing development, a strong feeling about of being anti-migration, lots of discomfort around the idea of an American trade deal and what that would mean for food. And you see it in the polling, HS2 is quite unpopular with older groups. There's a lot of skepticism towards trade with China, particularly in older groups. Now, all these things might be good things of themselves. I wouldn't wish to suggest there aren't good reasons for opposing trade with China. But the commonality of all those things is that when presented with a trade-off between doing something which will be enhancing for growth versus not doing it for reasons that you want to preserve your green belt or whatever, lots of older people are choosing, their revealed preference is for the anti-growth option. Now, this is really important because those older voters are a bigger part of the Conservative base these days. And so the Conservative Party, you see it coming through in the things that backbenchers are saying and where the backbencher rebellions are coming from, is siding with increasingly the ungrowth option. Now, why is that, particularly with older voters and the people that we saw in these focus groups? One is you could suppose it might be cultural reasons that people are more reluctant to change as they get older. Doesn't sit brilliantly with Brexit in that Brexit was an upheaval rather than a retaining of the status quo. There is some sort of research that I looked at that suggests this is a life cycle thing. So there's studies from Italy which suggest that older elites become impatient because they don't expect to see big returns on investment, right? So if you're younger, you're more willing to put up with 10 years of railway building because you expect to ride it for 50 years. If you're older, you simply don't make that calculation. But what I think is really important and fits kind of squarely to what some of the ideas that this report hints at is that older voters actually in this country were in the fortunate position as a result actually often of policy are comfortable. They've been decoupled from the economic cycle. So that's partly evident in the fact that of housing wealth. Lots of people in this country, older people, own their properties outright, and also things like the state pension triple lock, which, as a matter of policy, is designed explicitly to insulate people from economic downturns. Now, that's really important in the context of Brexit, and it's something that Nick Pearce at the University of Bath has suggested, that effectively insulates you from the consequences of your vote, right? So that it disinhibits risk. And so, we heard this in the focus group among some of the older members saying, I think a no-deal Brexit would be really hard. I'm fully alive to the idea that there might be medicine shortages, but I think it would be worth it. Whereas some of the younger members, perhaps those involved in businesses, were more skeptical about that risk. So that's a big extrapolation, but I think that is a very, very important part of answering the riddle of why would it be that wealthier people or comfortable people would vote for Brexit when we think, or we're often told, it's actually a response to hardship. Actually, it's actually a product of being insulated from hardship. And I think, and we hear this, you talk to sort of cabinet ministers, former cabinet ministers who say this is a big debate they have in their constituencies when they're talking about housing. People simply say, what do we need growth for? We have everything we want here. Why do we need to put up with the disruption to deliver growth? I think this has really profound consequences for the Conservative Party, if it's true, in that On the one hand, we see in the report and we hear from focus groups, people say that they really support levelling up, manufacturing restored, new opportunities for young people. This is kind of what Boris Johnson's built his administration around. On the other hand, when it comes to bite, do people actually want those things? And Demos, the think tank, did some really fascinating research where they polled people on, do you want to see manufacturing returning to your town? Do you want to see a university open in your town if it means that people are coming in from outside, not just from overseas, but from other nearby areas? And there's a particular skepticism amongst older, more Brexity voters to that because it entails disruption that they didn't want to entertain. So how you reconcile the desire for regeneration, for levelling up, and actually just providing new sources of growth for the British economy in the future, with a revealed preference actually of anti-growth politics born of comfort, is I think the big tension that that we're going to see play out time and again.
Thanks very much indeed, Matt. Actually, you've given me a perfect segue just to flag that we're going to be posting a working paper in the next month or so by Jane Green and Raluca Pahantu, which is really interesting because it talks specifically about this issue of wealth as insurance. And the question they set themselves actually is why wealthy voters support Brexit. It's precisely for the reasons you talk about, not least housing wealth, which acts as a buffer against you. You're more willing to take risks to vote against the status quo if you are insured by wealth. It's a really, really interesting piece of work. So look out for that on our website. I've got one more or less cephalogical question, which I suppose I'm going to pose to you, Paula, in the first instance, which is it the case that basically it was the Tory shires that delivered the Leave vote, and we've exaggerated the degree to which the left behind were responsible for it? So, I mean, what are the relative numbers, I suppose, is the question.
Is something I don't have in my head, I'm afraid. But it's bound to be the case that the biggest part of any vote is drawn from, unless it's very skewed. So we're talking about a vote that was 52-48. If it was very skewed, we might get a different pattern. When you've got a vote that's very close, most of it's going to be drawn by the most populous areas. So there are two ways of asking the question, both of which give you an understanding of the Leave vote, but in a different way. So you can ask the question about how the Leave vote was made up. And yes, it was made up of more, I don't have the numbers to hand, but yes, it is the case that the Leave vote overall is a little bit more middle class, a little bit more likely to be in the south of England, because that's where most of the people are. But if you ask the question of an individual voter, what makes them more likely to be a Leave voter or a Remain voter, that's where characteristics such as age and education in particular are really good, really strong predictors of individual level votes. So it asks two different questions, and that's why we get so many different academic answers to the question what caused Brexit, because you can ask the question in lots of different ways and you're explaining a very fine margin.
Brilliant. Does anyone else want to come in on that particular question? I'm taking that as a unanimous no. The next question we've got from Peter Williamson, who's curious, as am I, why were people looking for greater trade autonomy? It's not usually something that exercises voters very much. Was it simply just reflecting the narrative of the Leave campaign, or was there something else? I mean, there are hints about different things in this report, aren't there? There are hints about the fact that actually we should be buying British and we're too dependent on foreign imports and the like. But does anyone want to have a go at this? Where does this interest in trade? Is it an interest in trade, or is it an interest in not trade? If you see what I mean.
I'll have a bit of a go at this. I mean, I think there is a sense, and we see this at a number of different political levels. You see it in relation to devolution in the UK, but also regional governments elsewhere in Europe, of people wanting to have the capacity to do something, but then wanting to use that capacity not to change them very much. And I suspect that links back to this sense of national identity and even national pride which I think may also be relevant for some of the things, the fascinating things that Matthew was saying. You know, this business of an appetite for risk amongst people that we might generally expect to be relatively risk averse. I'm sure that it's partly about the insulation effects of owning houses and you know, and having wealth and having, you know, protected pensions and so on. But I also think it's partly to do with these identity and pride questions. In other words, voting Brexit is a vote for change in one sense, but it's a vote to get back to something that is seen as more authentic. It's a vote to get back to a time when you could have more pride in Britain, when made in England meant high quality. You know, there was a certain amount of what struck me as quite nostalgic talk about how, you know, made in England used to refer to better things and made in China meant something that was kind of cheap and tacky. And that has a real sort of 1970s feel to me. I mean, you know, we may have all sorts of reasons for concern about goods that are made in China, but their poor quality these days isn't typically one of those concerns. So the appetite for risk, in a sense, is an appetite for change. But for these people, I think there was a sense that actually what they were voting for was, you know, to get something back, you know, and in that sense, that take back control. You know, we used to have control. That's the authentic situation for Britain, and we want to go back to that. It kind of lowers the stakes on risk, because the current position is seen as kind of unsatisfactory in almost in an existential sense.
Anyone else? Just Ceri, have you unmuted yourself?
Yeah, I have. I would just add, I think that there was also a degree to which I think that some of the sort of messaging around kind of vote leave type narratives was, you know, really strongly resonated with people. So this notion of taking back control, but not thinking a great deal more about what that actually meant. So what we found is that people spent a lot of time discussing in workshops a kind of high level sense of things, but when pressed on detail found it a lot harder to kind of move to the detail, to the consequences, to the actualities. And so I think that there was also some success with that, the kind of conflating ideas around kind of sovereignty and control, and absolutely, Dan, the way you've described it, I think's exact in terms of that to something that we previously had. And so I think with respect to trade in particular, and at the time that we were doing those workshops, I think that, you know, kind of trade was really on the agenda when we were still wrangling between, you know, deal, no deal, and kind of Trump and prospect of, you know, trading relationships with the USA was really in the kind of public discourse in a really kind of visible way. So I think that might also account in part, it's not the most sophisticated of things, but I think that certainly for people at the time, some of these links and relationships were being made and solidified, but then internally contradicted in some of the ways that Dan has said, and what we also know to be true around a kind of wish to also retain degrees of regulation or food standards and kind of food safety, we actually are allied with kind of current approaches in the EU. So I think, yeah, it's an interesting knot to pull a bit further.
Brilliant, thank you. Got a couple of questions. I'm very disappointed by the lack of questions on the European Super League, people. I mean, I'd have thought that would be dominating my question board, but anyway. So we've got a couple of questions that are broadly linked. The first of which is from Stephen Evans, who says, English comfortable leavers take pride in the nation, but which nation, the UK or England? Are comfortable leavers comfortable with the UK breaking up? And as if that weren't enough to be getting your teeth into, there's another question from Ian Clark, God, rather you lot than me, which is, what is British identity? You can pretend to have Wi-Fi problems if you want, but who wants to?
I'll start, but I'm throwing the what is British identity to Dan. I think it came across really clearly in the workshops, things that survey evidence have shown us over and over and over again, that many of these voters in England do not make a clear distinction between England and Britain, and they talk about their identity almost not exclusively but almost interchangeably. There isn't a lot of hard distinction made between it. Very different, as I'm sure Dan will talk to, from the Scottish and the Welsh groups, where those two things are clearly distinctive and clearly talked about in different terms. In the English groups, they'll talk about national pride, but at the same time talk about keep Britain tidy. There's no firm line that you can draw between the two. And we know that from other research as well, that very, very many of those who feel or express their identity as being strongly English will also express a very strong British identity. So it's not something that easily peels apart. But I'm going to throw the bigger question to Dan.
Ceri and Matt, you're very, very welcome to chip in as well if you'd like on these issues. But Dan, do you want to?
Right. I mean, I think this is really fascinating and really important stuff. I'm not sure that directly from these workshops we get precise answers to these questions, as Paula was hinting. If we kind of situate it in a wider body of research, though, there's some fascinating stuff that comes up through the workshops on exactly these kinds of issues. And I agree wholeheartedly with Paula about this kind of fused or blurred kind of Anglo-Britishness in England. We did have one or two people come through and really raise questions about, particularly about the Scots and the influence of the Scots on what were seen as English decisions taken in Westminster, and one or two people in England who were also kind of puzzled by whether Britain was one country or whether Scotland and Wales were also other countries. But it was seen as an issue for Scotland and Wales rather than an English issue. You know, the core of Britain is seen as England. It is also worth saying that I don't recall, although someone probably did at some point, but I don't recall many people talking about the UK. People talk about Britain and have pride in Britain. They don't have pride in the UK particularly. I mean, occasional references to UK government and so on. But what we do know from other research, and there's a book that colleagues of mine, Richard Wynne-Jones and Ailsa Henderson, have published recently, but I've also done some research with them, which I think shows pretty clearly that Britishness doesn't really function politically as one identity across Britain. In other words, Britishness in England has a different set of resonances to Britishness in Scotland and Wales, where it's much more similar. So although Englishness and Britishness are kind of fused, when you do research that tries to disentangle them and think about the relative priority that an individual gives to English identity or British identity, it's pretty clear that people who give priority to Englishness in England tended to vote Leave, and people who give priority to British identity in England tended to vote Remain. It also seems to be the case that, you know, people who emphasize English identity think Boris Johnson's doing a better job with the pandemic, and people who emphasize British identity think he's not doing such a good job. But in Scotland and Wales, it's the other way around. In other words, in Scotland, the stronger your British identity, the more likely you were to vote Leave. And the stronger and more exclusive your Scottish identity, the more likely you were to vote Remain. And interestingly, it's that way round in Wales as well, despite the fact that, you know, Wales as a country voted Leave. You know, it's another of these kind of tendencies that Matthew was talking about to homogenize places, right? There are still lots of people in Wales who voted Remain, and they tend to be people who prioritize a Welsh identity. So I think this is a really critical reality of Britain now, which has huge implications for our politics and also for our political analysis. So, you know, in a sort of slightly techie, psephological kind of a way, it means we can no longer use Britishness as a reference category in modeling vote choice if Britishness is identified with opposite political attitudes in different parts of Britain. You know, it just doesn't work as the benchmark that you can test other identities against anymore.
Interesting. Matt or Ceri, would you like to come in on this?
I think the only thing I'd add, I think, is that in terms of the report anyway, it certainly doesn't answer either of those questions in any type of detail. But I think the points that we've been picking up on previously around kind of what is, well, so a kind of restoration of pride in a particular type of British identity or a sense of identity, obviously is something that people talked a lot about. The presence of symbols, some kind of moral kind of codes or values around freedom of speech, and this, this kind of set of ideas that might be bringing together what it means to be British as opposed to what it doesn't, although troubled in all the ways that Dan has kind of suggested. But I think one of the things that was interesting for me about the research is that both Leavers and Remainers in this comfortable category pointed to this need for unity, this idea that we need to kind of restore pride and that we need to kind of get back to a clear sense of identity, British identity that is, as a result of our exit from the EU. But actually what made up that identity wasn't agreed on. So certainly that both agreed that, as I say, we should be kind of uniting somehow over post-Brexit, but there are clear differences in what Leavers and Remainers want Britain to take pride in. So I think that that's another kind of axis along which trying to kind of understand the question a bit more is interesting to interrogate further.
I feel go on, Matt.
Oh, sorry. I can't answer the question because I've not seen the work, but one of the questions I find most interesting and perhaps most difficult about Scottish independence, both whether it happens, but also the build up to it, is what it does to what spirits it sort of disinters in the Brexit debate, both around English identity, but also around the mindset of the Brexit negotiations, which was very sort of uncompromising, very, very hardened, and whether one sees that sort of posture of, let's go for no deal, let's negotiate hard, transferred from focused on Brussels to focused on Edinburgh. I think the study on Englishness that Dan mentions does have some work that suggests that people who identify most strongly as English are keener to drive a hard bargain in that scenario. So things like, imposing passport checks at the English-Scottish border. People who identify as English are keener for that. So this is, should the debate on Scottish independence really take off post-May, then that will definitely be something to watch for.
Can I add something to that?
You may indeed.
I think one thing to remember as well, these groups took place last summer, and that meant that particularly the English groups were much more aware of Scotland and Wales as distinct political identities because of the COVID crisis than they would have been had we done these 6 months earlier, before that had arisen. Yeah. It also meant that people were starting to have views around things like tiers because they'd had experience of having very different sort of local and regional policy within England. And one of the things that came through was, although they were really keen to take back control, that was still control to the centre. There wasn't a sense that they then wanted to give that control to all the regions to get on with it in their own way. It was take back control, but keep it still quite centralised. And I think that just connects with what Matt was saying there about, if the Scottish independence debate is going to rage on and on, but if it moves to the next stage, there's going to need to be a big conversation about what happens in England. And some of this work starts to talk to what parts of the English electorate might want. And I think the thing that worries me about that is that I suspect solutions to that English question will lie on the same axis as the Brexit divide and will therefore repolarize that divide rather than bringing people together.
I feel I can't let this conversation go on without holding this up and recommending it to you, which is a very, very good read on Englishness, and it's actually absolutely fascinating on all these questions. For those of you who are interested in this, you can probably not do better than read that book. That's my marketing done. There's a question about, it's a very, very open question, but it's about less well-off Remainers and what we know about them. Now, I know this doesn't feature in these focus groups, but I suppose it goes back to that question again as to, do less well-off Remainers have most in common with well-off Remainers? Or I suppose the answer might be, well, it depends what you're talking about, whether you're talking about economics or values again. But does anyone want to say, you don't have to if you don't want to, because it's a bit off topic for this report, but
I started to unpack some of these questions with some survey data. So I've got some sort of feelings for it rather than really detailed data. And my sense was that this kind of formed a bit of a ranking. So on lots of issues, the low income Remainers did have quite a lot in common with the lower income leavers, particularly in the younger age groups. So age kind of cuts across it in an interesting way as well. But what they really shared that I thought was interesting was that sense of political disengagement that's become associated with the low income leavers. No one speaks for people like me, those kinds of questions. So I think there are, as I said with the other question, I think depending on the particular issues that you push against, you form different coalitions of these different groups.
There's a really interesting comment from Jeff Horn, actually, who says, isn't there a danger of suggesting that Remain voters don't want control? And doesn't this divide essentially just come back to how much control one thinks we enjoyed as a member of the European Union? So it's not that one side wants control and the other side doesn't. It's simply that one side thought we enjoyed a degree of control in the EU that the other side didn't. Do you think that sounds fair enough to me, actually, off the top of my head?
I think it sounds fair enough, but I think it also, I wonder how it might connect to some of Matt's comments around this idea of British identity and what you think that means. So I think one of the things in terms of sort of remaking a sense of unity, at very kind of top level, relatively so in terms of the data, but Leavers obviously very focused on taking back control with respect to sovereignty. So this is how they didn't think they had it, whilst we have membership and now think we can. Whereas Remainers, comfortable Remainers tended to be more in this idea that they wanted to be open to the world somehow and collaborative somehow, and that be a kind of facet of the ways in which they might wish to operate. So again, that both reinforces the idea that they thought they might have control in the EU, but I do wonder how that also splits between this kind of like hard-nosed, tough negotiating kind of idea, sense of self around our ability to, as an island, kind of get out there in the world and kind of re-establish a more romanticized or kind of nostalgia related idea of who we used to be when we were tough and kind of British Empire type connotations, which came through in some of our data, as opposed to comfortable Remainers who, as you say, it's not about completely suggesting that they don't care about control. They certainly do on immigration. They certainly do around that kind of anti-welfare piece. So yeah, I'd say there's some of the other aspects of that came through in the data.
Brilliant, thank you. It's a very interesting suggestion in the questions that comfortable Leavers are probably rugby fans rather than football fans, so thanks for that. This is quite an interesting question. I don't know if we can pass this from the focus groups or not, but to what extent do we think these comfortable Leavers were well informed about the implications of Brexit? I mean, to what extent do you think they worried about the detailed implications? I mean, that in a sense that's come from what Matt was saying earlier, was these people could afford to worry less. Maybe if you're comfortable, you might not worry so much about potential negative side effects. But does anyone want to chip on this? Did these people understand what Brexit meant, or was that not their focus, the details of what Brexit meant? Matt seems to be going for his mute. Are you going for your mute button, Matt?
Yeah, I can have a go at that. In that, I used to work in Brussels, and I remember looking at the time, the European institutions have spent a lot of time trying to research the link between knowledge of the EU and attitudes towards it, and the link is pretty fuzzy, which isn't surprising when you think about it. In that, if you are sort of animated by Euroscepticism, you probably spend quite a lot of time reading about the European Union. But so the hope that if you just educate people more about the EU, they will learn to like it, actually doesn't quite work out. And I've never quite been convinced by the argument that people knowing that Brexit means a 4.5 or 5% trim in GDP over 15 years is necessarily a deal breaker. Not because people don't believe it, or because, but simply because all these things are about judging risks, and what do you value your constitutional arrangements over the convenience of a supermarket? So my impression from the groups is that people you could not distinguish very well between the Remainers and the Leavers on their understanding of what Brexit might mean for medicine. So was simply a judgment on whether actually, over the long term, you can adjust away from that, or whether actually you think other things simply matter more than that.
Anyone else?
I just think in the absence of kind of realistic propositions, so kind of modelling, forecasting, knowledge, as you say, Matt, kind of bringing more knowledge to the fore doesn't necessarily have this connection to a kind of change in attitude. And I do wonder whether, obviously it's only through the particular way we designed and ran the research, but I think that people kind of out and out tended to focus on other things, which spoke more to kind of socio-cultural things, you kind of less tangible things. That's what people wanted to talk about more so than, so the extent to which they may or may not have been in the detail. But I think there was a degree to which some of that detail was also parked because it was in the too difficult box, either because it was too uncertain, or we simply didn't know, or it was too far away from people, abstracted in the sense that they couldn't understand the relationship between it and their daily lives. But then overlaid with that is also the conversation we've been having about kind of relative insulation. So I think it's probably a combination of those factors which kind of led people to focus more on, how they felt, and whether they felt that they could kind of recreate or reclaim a sense of how they live and how they want to live through a moving away from membership of the EU as a sort of priority lens.
Now, talking of cultural divides, Tim Bale, hello Tim, brings up a piece in the conversation today by a couple of people at Nuffield in Oxford, Anthony Heath and Lindsay Richards, and they're arguing that the values divide between north and south of England is the biggest value divide. And Tim was just wondering whether any of this had come up at all in the focus groups, whether there were any hints of this sort of intra-English values divide.
I'll take that. I mean, it did come up in a number of the workshops in the north. There was a clear sense of being from the north, and some discussion about how Northerners were friendlier, how people who'd spent time living in the south, hadn't really enjoyed it that much and had moved back. So some of those sorts of themes ran through the discussion. Also, a real sense, I think, that that people were keen to tell us about how attractive the places that they lived were. That these were nice places to live. So it's if the kind of friendly north feels a bit cliched, they were absolutely repudiating the "it's grim up north" cliche. So I think there were some identity things in the north. It wasn't articulated in the same way in the workshops in the south. Although I do think there were some significant but maybe slightly hidden differences which are relevant to all the discussion around the so-called levelling up agenda and the things in which people want investment, right? So in the northeast in particular, there was a lot of skepticism about HS2, which was seen as only getting as far as Birmingham or maybe Manchester, and Manchester was it was dubious whether that counted as kind of proper north as far as they were concerned. A lot of interest in investment in industry and apprenticeships in the north, and maybe a slightly romantic sense of being able to get back some of the industries that we used to have. Really strikingly in the south, right? So in a number of different places, there was this kind of concern about overdevelopment. I remember someone living in a village outside York complaining about how a whole lot of new houses were being built in the village without proper facilities. So it wasn't just in the south, but when you go to the group that was in sort of outer London in the southeast, the sense of being overdeveloped was really tangible. The sense of it being crowded, that there just weren't enough facilities. All the roads are crowded. Someone in a town just on the fringes of London talked about how the police station had been closed down and it was being converted into flats. And that sense of kind of losing essential services and just every bit of land being built on came through really powerfully in the kind of outer London and southeast discussion. And you know, that for me raises a question about so-called leveling up, because in a sense, it's more about kind of spreading out or leveling out. That you know, too much is happening in the southeast, and you know, maybe there's an opportunity to develop other places, not necessarily through big expensive transport infrastructure. You know, that didn't really come up as a big ask for anyone. The asks were around apprenticeships, around the NHS and care, and then again around police and also the military, and especially in the southeast, there was a kind of tangible sense that actually, you know, on a Friday or Saturday night, some of these towns have become quite unpleasant. You know, there were kind of groups of lads kind of out on the lager and not enough police to control it. So there were people actually talking about not going out. They really liked their town, but they didn't want to go out on a Friday or Saturday night because it was a bit leery, it was a bit unpleasant. And that didn't come through in the same way for me in some other parts. So it's this sense of a kind of an unbalanced Britain comes through not in what people themselves said. They didn't talk about Britain being unbalanced, but in the differences between different parts of England in particular.
Anyone else on North-South? You don't have to if you don't want to. There's another question here, interesting question from John, who says, I'm getting the impression that comfortable leavers are more anti-globalisation than anti-EU. Would that be fair? You can tell that's a good question, John, just from the expressions.
So I'm not sure. I think that would be something you couldn't completely take from these workshops, because there were lots of comments about being able to open up trade, open up immigration even outside of the EU. It wasn't there for everybody. It wasn't always seen as positive. So I don't think I'd want to kind of extrapolate to all comfy leavers from that, because it wasn't something that was kind of all of them said the same thing. But I think it would be wrong to say that none of them had an eye on the global. I think some of them did.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And it is one of those areas that's tricky, because there seem to be kind of different perspectives within the groups themselves. So, you know, as well as being crowded, you know, we got some discussion about, you know, Britain being a small island and there being only so many people that Britain could take, and that kind of anxiety about migration and immigration, you know, came through quite strongly. At the same time, you did have some people in these groups who ran businesses and were worried about being able to sort of staff their businesses, or, you know, whether they were in kind of computing type jobs and they were worried about being able to recruit programmers, or whether they were managers in an NHS or a care setting and were worried about getting people in to do the jobs that they needed to have done. I mean, something came through there a bit, which again speaks to this question about control. There was quite a lot of confidence that the UK government ought to be able to introduce the famous Australian-style points-based immigration system and calibrate quite finely who we would let in. There seemed to be quite a lot of confidence that people would want to come if we were able to identify the people we wanted to let in. And sometimes a bit of talk about how that wasn't necessarily always kind of high income people or highly educated people, that the skills we need might be in other areas, including around care. So I think there was a bit of a division there, a background concern about migration, but then some people bringing in these other perspectives, which did suggest kind of more openness to the world, but with a kind of assumption that Britain would be a kind of global leader. So it's not kind of being a taker of globalization. It's the opportunity to kind of lead globally that seemed to animate some people.
Dan's just talking there reminded me of two bits from the focus groups that I think are really, workshops that were really relevant to this point. One is the point you just made. There was a business owner who questioned why they could employ a German programmer but not an Indian programmer. So there was that kind of thing. But there was also, interestingly, a couple of the groups that specifically spoke about taking in migrants from Hong Kong. And that wasn't seen negatively. It was seen as almost as a responsibility of a global nation. So in that sense, there were some real tensions in there. And I don't think it would be fair to characterize this group as anti-global in a simplistic sense.
Brilliant. Mervyn Samuels, we'd love to talk to the same groups again in a year's time. If anyone from the SRC, our funders, are watching, that's very, very strong public pressure for us to be able to do this again in a year. There's a couple of questions, just sort of touching on where you left off there, Paula, on the global. How much of this conversation was about rebuilding a global Britain, having global ambitions? And one specific question, to what extent did people mention, I mean, above and beyond the point about Indian programmers, was there much explicit mention of the Commonwealth in these focus groups? But was global Britain seen as something above and beyond, you know, economic or migration opportunities? Did this figure at all, I suppose, is the...
I don't think it did, really. I think the sense I got most from people was that their concerns were quite local, and they had lots of concerns about pride in and development of their local areas. Of course, how they define local is a question for another study.
Yeah, I don't think global Britain was a thing, really. Themes that connect to the idea of global Britain were absolutely present. But as I say, that was kind of very much wrapped around this sense of kind of nostalgic optimism, the kind of back to the future idea that kind of the identity of being British was kind of necessarily a kind of global trading identity. You know, that didn't really necessarily follow through to any kind of specific kind of vision of global Britain per se, I don't think. Although I would say, you know, I think it's very important to add that, you know, to the extent that there are kind of gaps in understanding or you know, tough trade-offs that aren't faced directly, I absolutely don't think that's unique to leavers, whether they're comfortable or not. I think the evidence shows that people on all sides of this divide, you know, tend to kind of take views that are consistent with the position of being in favor of Brexit or against Brexit. Almost sort of, and so there's a kind of an emotional element to it, almost more than a kind of rational one, and people will accept things that aren't true on both sides of the debate because they feel consistent with the position that feels comfortable to them.
We're almost out of time. We've got a couple of minutes left, so does anyone want to chip in on this? No? I think then at that point I might wrap it up rather than starting a new conversation which ends up with me sort of giving you 5 seconds each to answer the question. I should just say to James Miller, the big 5+ Tottenham aren't comfortable leavers, they're uncomfortable non-leavers is my prediction. But I'd just like to thank all 4 of you, Matt, Dan, Ceri, Paula, for what was a fascinating conversation. I'd encourage you very, very strongly to look at both reports because the focus groups were very, very rich, and you get a real sort of sense of what these people are thinking and feeling as only these sorts of groups can provide. Just to remind you, we have another event at the same time tomorrow, he says, hoping desperately it is at the same time, which looks forward to the local elections and where we might conceivably build on some of these conversations actually about what our politics hold. But for the moment, thank you ever so much for watching. Thank you even more to the four of you for sparing us your time. Look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care, have a good day, and enjoy the weather. Bye-bye.